Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Cam Webster, and welcome to The Art of Boring, the podcast where we dive deeper into Mawer's investment philosophy and thinking in order to help you, our listeners, become more informed investors. Ultimately, we hope to connect you with the people at Mawer who find excitement in delivering on Be Boring, Make Money. On this episode, we speak with John Wilson, analyst on the global small cap team, about Mawer's use of Scuttlebutt. We cover the concept of Scuttlebutt and its definition in the investing world, explain its importance to long-term thinking, and discover its place in our investment process. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. Information relating to investment approaches or individual investments should not be construed as advice or endorsement. Any views expressed in this podcast are based upon the information available at the time and are subject to change.
With me today is John Wilson. He's an analyst on the global small cap team. He's here to talk to us about Scuttlebutt. But before we get into Scuttlebutt on Scuttlebutt, why don't, John, you just introduce yourself, tell listeners kind of your path to Mawer and what you do day to day.
Sure. I've been at Mawer for 5 years, and as you mentioned, I'm on the global small cap team. So what that means is I get to invest in companies around the world. Our universe is quite large. We have 22,000 companies in the universe, which means I'm speaking to a new company and learning about new industries all the time, which is quite interesting and quite an exciting job. And I guess my history, I've been here for 5 years, and previously I went to Wilfrid Laurier, where I went to school for business.
Welcome. You're visiting Calgary from Toronto, and you're here to talk to us about Scuttlebutt, which I guess in the days of yore, the Scuttlebutt was the cask of water where sailors would go and basically gossip.
That's right. So
we're here to talk about maybe investing gossip, but how we maybe go about that. It's probably not gossip in terms of how we go about it. And why don't we start with how we define it at Mawer and how do we use it in investing?
Yeah, absolutely. So Scuttlebutt's one of the tools that we have in our due diligence toolkit here at Mawer. So the purpose of it, or what it is it's collecting information from suppliers, customers, industry associations about a particular investment. And the idea behind that is to corroborate what management has told us. It can be to understand the industry better. It can be even a source of new ideas. It's all part of this mosaic theory where you cobble together these pieces of information in order to form an opinion.
Okay, what's the driving force behind that? I mean, I used to be a sell-side analyst, so I'd interview the management team and think that, yeah, I'm getting most of the story. So is it to avoid kind of getting caught up in hype in some certain circumstances? I mean, it's global small cap, so you guys may look at pretty new stage public companies. So they'd be at various different levels of investor relations sophistication. In the global small cap world, what particular about Scuttlebutt is really, really valuable?
I think it's absolutely what you alluded to. We often say that investing's not black and white, it's shades of gray. And one of the things that Scuttlebutt helps with is differentiating between different shades of gray. And maybe I'll give an example around that. A while back, we were doing research on a company in Australia that provides accounting software. And one of the things when we spoke with management, the way the accounting software works is there's software that the accountants themselves use, and this software is very hard to replace. It's very sticky. It helps them manage their workflow. So that's one piece of the business, and the other piece of the business is software that's used by small businesses to run their accounts and keep track of their accounting. When we originally talked to management, they talked about the importance of having your accountant be on the same software as the small businesses. So it creates this idea of a network effect. And one of the things that we did to try to understand that better was we got on the phone and started calling accounting firms to try to understand, so how strong of a preference is this, that your customers and your clients are on the same accounting platform from the same provider. And it was interesting what we learned. The management team, the one shade of gray was it's very, very important that they're on the same accounting software because this allows them to more easily transfer information. They can send documents, this whole host of reasons. When we talked to the accounting firms, it wasn't that was untrue. It was that the importance of it was perhaps, it wasn't as important. So it was something that they had a preference for, but it wasn't an absolute must-have. And I think that going back to the analogy around shades of gray, that was one of the things where we said, oh yeah, actually it maybe isn't perhaps as strong of a competitive advantage as we initially thought.
So that story just makes me think of how do you get people to open up to you, to talk honestly about the questions you're answering. Like, to me, I was wondering as you were describing that, was John posing it as an accountant, or do we, when we go to collect Scuttlebutt, outright say we're investors, we're just here to do due diligence, I want to ask you a few questions?
Yeah, no, right away we inform them who we are. We're an investment manager based out of Canada. We don't try to be someone that we're not. I don't think that there's a high degree of integrity in doing that. So I think it's really important that you're upfront with them and you explain your background. We're thinking about investing in XYZ, and just being really upfront I think is really important. What
makes you decide Scuttlebutt is an appropriate tool to use in a situation like that?
I think there's certain times when you are doing Scuttlebutt where you have a particular question that you want answered. And I think that's a good example of a question that we wanted to have answered. So in that case, it was very deliberate, the approach we used and the types of questions that we had for the accountants. I think other times it almost goes back to the concept of learning about the industry or unknown unknowns. So you can get on the phone with a company or a competitor or supplier, customer, and you can find out something about the industry that management hadn't informed you about. And those can be just as valuable as well. Sometimes it's targeted, I'd say. And sometimes through these conversations, you have these things that pop up that you didn't necessarily go into the call thinking that you'd learn.
Sometimes it's outright strategy. Other times it's part of due diligence, and we're just kind of trying to tick the boxes here in terms of what management's saying, what information in the industry is there. Maybe within the context of Scuttlebutt, we can think a little bit about how does the rest of the investing world use it? Like it seems common sense, right? So we'll listen to management, we'll ask them a set of questions. They'll give us a response. Now let's go test those responses. How common is the use of Scuttlebutt in the industry, do you think?
I don't think it's used that often. I think that you find cases where people do use it. But if you think about it, this involves a lot of rejection. So when I was calling those accounting firms, I got a lot of people just hanging up right away, that why speak to this investor from Canada, what's the point? So there's been instances where I've cold called for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and I might maybe get 5 data points, 5 conversations. So that's a lot of, first of all, emotional pain. It actually, it's quite painful to be rejected all the time. And the other thing is, if you think about it from a cost return perspective, it really makes sense if you're a long-term investor to spend 2 hours getting rejected on the phone so you can get these 5 pieces of data that change your view about a company you're going to invest in for the next 9 years. I think that, there's stats out there around the average hold period in the industry, 6 months, a year, very short term in nature. For investors with that sort of time horizon, oftentimes it doesn't make sense to make that an upfront investment because they're not going to be in the company for that long. We can use this information for the next 8-9 years that we gather. So I think that in that respect, you certainly don't see it as much in shorter term oriented investors. So
we just established that Scuttlebutt seems to have more value if you're a long-term investor, and that's what we are at Mawer. We're long-term investors. What I maybe want to transition to, John, is just where does it fit in the process for global small cap? So how often in your daily work, how often do you find yourself, well, yeah, I'm doing another call that's not with management, it's trying to corroborate what they're saying, therefore I'm doing Scuttlebutt?
Oh, all the time. For every single...
Like every day?
All the time, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, past weekend, actually, it's one of those things where it's just always on my mind because we have this focus on it. I was hanging out with one of my friends who's a carpenter, and immediately my mind switched over to starting to ask him about how long it takes him to measure the windows when he goes over to a prospective client's house. And that's based on the fact that we have an investment in a company that provides windows and also does the installation on it. So one of the things we look for in investment is a search cost. So something that makes it difficult or inconvenient for a customer to search and compare many different product prices. Because when you have that search cost, it creates an opaque market. It creates a market where price isn't necessarily the most important part. So I started asking about that, and he explained that oftentimes these customers will only get 1 or 2 quotes because every time you get a quote on this, someone has to come over to your house, measure up all your windows, and provide a quote for it. So it's actually quite inconvenient for the homeowner. So immediately I thought, oh, that's great. That's a search cost. So that's one. But again, it happens all the time. Another one, we're invested in these value-added resellers. So basically what these companies do is they sell IT, whether it's hardware or software, to companies like Mawer. And it's not just the hardware and software they sell, but there's a huge advice component. And I still remember that investment because there was a very powerful aha moment where I went to our IT department and asked them, so how long have you been with our provider? Oh, 7 years. Would you think about switching? No, we wouldn't switch at all. Well, do people offer you lower prices? Oh yeah, they offer us lower prices. Well, why don't you switch? Well, because I don't know whether they're a trustworthy source. And that was the aha moment. Again, you want customers where there's a trust component because it introduces a switching cost. And I think that's another characteristic that we look for in investments. So having these conversations, having it always on your mind is very helpful in the investment process. And it's something we do all the time in Global Small Cap and in the research team as a whole.
And we collect that information somewhere, so it's accessible on an ongoing basis. So if I became an analyst tomorrow, I could look in somewhere and learn something about that conversation you had about IT
Absolutely.
providers.
So we have this great database called M42 that we use across the firm where we store all our notes, not just Scuttlebutt, but notes on companies. And there's great functionality in there where you can not only tag it for this particular company, but you can tag it for related companies as well. So if I collect Scuttlebutt on a value-added reseller in the UK, I can also tag one in Germany and one in US. And that way, when you go into the database to look at a particular company, there's all the notes on it, and it's great for sharing information across the team.
Great. So we've established this is all important stuff for long-term investing. There's shades of gray. You do it every day, so it sounds like it's almost a mental model. And you mentioned network effect. So is there a network effect to Scuttlebutt? So what I'm thinking is there might be an example where you're doing due diligence on one company and you talk to another and you end up investing in the other, even though you thought you were going to invest in the original one.
I think that it actually can cause quite a dramatic shift in direction. So an example would be we originally were looking at a Colombian exchange.
What kind of exchange?
A stock exchange.
Oh, stock exchange. Okay.
Yeah. And we were trying to get our heads around the model and some of the risks around that model. And we ended up speaking to a company in Oslo, Bors. And we actually, after completing that conversation, we were actually much more impressed with the management team there and the company there.
Okay, so you went from Bogota to Oslo.
Yes.
All
dramatic.
in 2 phone calls, probably.
Yes, quite a dramatic shift. And
Okay.
it's still a holding in the Global Small Cap Fund.
So sometimes there's dramatic shifts, John. You gave us an example there. What about judging the truthfulness of the answers you're getting? So you're approaching people, you're saying, yes, we're investors based in Canada. How do you determine if the answers you're getting back are truthful?
It's a very hard thing to do, and I don't think you can ever know 100%. I think about kind of the mental models there in statistics. So you want a large sample size. You want it to be representative of the population. So the way that applies in Scuttlebutt is you want to collect multiple data points, and often it's helpful to collect data points from many different angles. So maybe talk to customers in multiple segments of the business. Don't just talk to a customer, but also talk to a supplier and try to get it from many different angles. I find that can be helpful. So I think another thing to consider is this idea we talk a lot about in research around Bayes' theorem. So one of the ideas in Bayes is that not all information in terms of updating your hypothesis is worth the same. And information that is rare is worth more in terms of that it updates. It has a larger weight.
So probabilistically, a piece of information is going to have more impact on your investment thesis.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then as it relates to Scuttlebutt, how do you get people, what's the incentive for people to actually give you that piece of information?
Well, I think that's a good way to think about rare information, or a good example of rare information is when you're talking to a company and you ask them, who do you respect in the industry? And if you put yourself in the shoes of the CEO, he doesn't really have the incentive. He's not biased to really sing accolades or give accolades to his competitors. So when you find there are multiple examples of competitors recommending and really praising another company, that's quite rare information, and we give it more weight. So I think that's another important mental model that we use when we're collecting Scuttlebutt. How rare is the information? And that all goes back to base.
Mm-hmm. So it comes into the overall rating of quality of the business.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
John, just on that note, it sounds like there may be variances across industries. So let's talk a little bit about how across industries maybe Scuttlebutt differs.
So I think that it is situational. So I think it does depend on the situation that you're in. And I think it relates to partly the business model.
Okay, so less industry, more business model.
More the question you're trying to answer, actually.
Okay.
So I think that's the crux of it.
So let's just get a sense, John, from you, because you're doing this Scuttlebutt collection every day. In your experience, and what's some of the most surprising information you've gotten out of doing this?
Well, I think it can actually change the investment thesis completely and have us walk away from investment. So an example that comes to mind is that we were looking at this company that provided data servers as well as IT services to their clients. And one of the things that we talked about with them is whether they're noticing pressure from public cloud. So there's this big trend to more organizations moving to the public cloud. Has that been something that you've seen historically? And they were very honest with us. They said, no, that's not something we've seen historically. And it's something that we're thinking about in the future, but we're not too concerned about it. So one of the things we did was we reached out to some of their customers to try to understand how they think about it. And one of the calls that we had with their customers said that, no, you're right, we haven't used it in the past. We haven't thought about using public cloud in the past. However, in the future, over the next 5 years, I think it's actually a high likelihood that we switch over to that. And the fact that the majority of the revenue of this company, this potential investment they were looking at, is generated from actually the rental of these servers that would be lost under public cloud, that automatically we did a 180-degree turn, and we decided not to invest in that. So you can have these quite dramatic instances of where the thesis completely changes, and I think you avoid some unforced errors.
Right. So you get a little redemption on that rejection, because you can actually reject somebody and say, yeah, you guys don't work out. So thanks, John. You've given us a really good sense of what Scuttlebutt is, how we use it, how important it is to long-term investing, maybe some of the pitfalls of it, and the fact that it really is essentially a mental model here for us at Mawer. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Cam.
And now it's time for the rapid fire round where we get to know John a little better. And I know when I first met you, you were kind of just learning how to ski because you're out here in Calgary. So what, in your mind, what's the hardest thing about learning to ski?
Stopping, yeah. By far the hardest thing.
Stopping?
Yeah. If you can get that figured out, you're doing all right, especially on the mountains out here.
Okay. All right. That is an important risk management strategy. Can you relate your experience learning how to ski to investing?
Well, I think that you're going to make a lot of mistakes initially, and it's important to have, if I had to use an analogy, a trainer, someone to help you down the hill. And I find that the whole investment process is very much almost an apprenticeship model where you have to work with a mentor for a long period of time in order to learn. So that would be my connection.
Cool. And you obviously read a lot as an analyst, but is there anything in particular you're reading right now or you like to read outside of investing?
Oh, outside of investing. I was already. Let's see. I'm reading a book called The Effective Engineer, which is actually quite good. It talks about a number of different methods to be an effective computer engineer, and I find that it's quite fascinating how much that applies to different domains.
Good one. And you recently relocated to Toronto from the Calgary office, so what do you like best about Toronto?
I would say the food is fantastic in Toronto. It's extremely good. Yeah, I think the other thing that with Toronto, just the population of the city, you get the opportunity to meet a lot of different people, connect in with a lot of different friends, and that's been terrific. Thanks, John. That was a great conversation on Scuttlebutt, and we'll have you on again soon, I'm sure. Thanks, Cam. Hey, everyone. Cam here again. To subscribe to the Art of Boring podcast, go to Mawer, that's mawer.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review on iTunes, which will help more people discover the Be Boring, Make Money philosophy. Again, thanks for listening.